most disturbing about it is that this is mainly killing civilians. 70% of all the people who are killed or have been killed so far are women, elderly, and children, and 40% are children. Now, then there may be some men who are also civilians among the killed. So the actual, damage or killing of Hamas fighters is relatively small, and the killing of the people is a lot. And the situation in the Gaza is absolutely unbelievable, because they were told that they should leave from the north, resettle to the south, which is practically impossible given the fact, how can you move 1 million people who don't have fuel, who have no water, no food, no medicine, and then when they arrive, or some of them arrive in the south, they're being bombed there anyway. Now this is a catastrophe, a human catastrophe, which, even, UN General Secretary Guterres, who is a very mild-mannered person, he basically attacked the Hamas atrocities against Israel, but he also said what is happening in Gaza is, absolutely intolerable. It's a complete violation of people's law. And for that, he was then immediately attacked by the Israeli ambassador to the UN, Erdogan, who called for the resignation of Guterres. And all Guterres said was the truth, what is happening. So this is an unbelievable situation, and there should and must be an immediate mobilization of many people for a ceasefire. The weapons must be put quiet. There must be a negotiated solution, and despite all the failures to put this on the agenda so far, mainly, because of the US vetoing it. I mean, Brazil, for example, had a motion for a ceasefire in the UN Security Council, and everybody voted for it except the United States vetoed it, so it did not pass. But nevertheless, where should this go until all the people in Gaza are either killed or displaced, kicked out, ethnic cleansing? I mean, where is the limit to what is happening there? So therefore, an immediate mobilization must be to stop the killing, to have a ceasefire, and then move in the direction of the proposal by China to have an immediate peace conference in the Middle East, for the Middle East, and then put on the agenda the question of a two-state solution, the UN Resolution 242, which is accepted international law because it was adopted by the UN Security Council. And then there must be what my late husband Lyndon LaRouche had proposed already in 1975, namely a comprehensive economic development plan for the entire region, the so-called Oasis plan, which would basically give the chance for economic development of all sides, and that way establish a foundation for peace. Now, if that is not done, people must be aware that we are in an acute danger of an escalation of not only the Middle East war, the Southwest Asia war, but in combination to the crisis of Ukraine. Now, in Ukraine, secretly, the United States had relocated the ATACMS missile into Ukraine, not making it public, but just doing it. This was vehemently attacked by the Russian ambassador in Washington, Anatoly Antonov, who basically said that means that the United States is directly moving for a confrontation with Russia. And so in combination with the situation in the Middle East, where the United States has moved a significant military force to the shores of Israel, namely the two aircraft carriers, USS Ford and USS Eisenhower, and in addition another warship, the USS Whitney, which are all now under the command of the commander of the Sixth Fleet, Vice Admiral Thomas Ishii, and there are other deployments maybe into the Gulf as well. So that means, and 12,000 soldiers are basically ready to engage. Now, if there is an escalation, if, let's say, the Israeli ground forces would move into Gaza, Hezbollah would attack Israel as a result, obviously you have basically everything geared towards an engagement with Iran. Senator Lindsey Graham, who has an unbelievable record as a war hawk, is right now in Israel with 9 other senators, and he has called to bomb Iran to stabilize the region. I mean, how far off of reality can you get than saying a thing like what Lindsay is saying there? I mean, I know that everybody who is concerned about the Middle East and Southwest Asia for decades is aware of the fact that, given the fact that there are nuclear weapons, in Israel, probably 200 nuclear weapons, and the danger that they would somehow come into play if Iran is attacked, all charts are off. That it has been a truth since decades in Southwest Asia, and especially now with the combination of the situation in Ukraine. I think, it's important that Putin, at the occasion of being the guest at the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing, was giving a press conference from the guest house where he basically, said almost like a side sentence. He said, I gave the order to put the Kinshal missile, which are these Mach 9 supersonic, extreme fast missiles who are not following ballistic trajectories, but which are maneuverable, that he has given the order that they are put on alert to fly permanently in MiG-21s over the Black Sea. They can obviously reach both Ukraine and also the Mediterranean, and potentially sink any US warship there. So I think if you then look how the entire Muslim world, the Islamic world, is, clearly preparing for an escalation. You have demonstrations practically in many countries, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, even in Europe. You had demonstrations in Spain, a couple of very significant ones, even in London, more than 100,000 people. In Barcelona, 70,000 people. So, I think we are sitting on a complete powder keg, and therefore an intervention is absolutely necessary to say we need to go to diplomacy, and we need to basically put the proposals on the table for an immediate peace conference. Now, I know this is very difficult because if the US vetoes it, what can you do? But I think it does require the mobilization of well-meaning people all over the world to shift the balance, because the alternative is straight into hell.
Thank you, Helga. If you're just joining us, my name is Jose Vega. I am the moderator for today's Saturday Town Hall. The title of our Town Hall is Our Choice, Nonviolent Coexistence or Violent Co-Annihilation. And this is our thumbnail. If you're just joining us and you stumbled upon this program, maybe you're a recurring viewer, or maybe you are somebody who wants to know what's going on in the Israel-Palestine situation. Maybe you've been sitting on the sidelines and you want to do something, or you have no idea what's going on and you want to know what's going on. Well, I'll tell you this. The first step is to do something. And I want to give you some examples of what has actually been happening. From our standpoint, first, the organization, the LaRouche Youth Movement, has been going to the campus of Columbia. For one, we've had an intervention happen on Hillary Clinton, something that I'll show later down during the discussion, and maybe we'll even get a live report about. Some of you may have seen this, where one of our members, Robert Castle, stood up to Hillary Clinton and said that this is a hypocritical speech. In other words, that what Hillary Clinton was saying was hypocritical, and asked her to denounce the warmongering efforts by our president, Joe Biden. But what also we've been doing, apart from that, is we've been taking actions like this. We have been singing in front of Columbia campus, and I will play this now. And this is coming off the heels after one day, after a day before that, that the singing happened, there was a walkout of students who walked out of their class and attended a protest in the center of Columbia. There were 800 to 1,000 students. But just last night, we've been seeing what seems to be spontaneous action happening, sit-ins happening. For example, I want to show you something here that happened last night where at Grand Central, you had thousands of people from Jewish Voice for Peace chanting and singing music. But what's important about what you're seeing right now is that they stopped Grand Central for at least 2.5 hours. Trains were suspended, entrances were blocked, and the police had to work around them. People could not go into the station. They either had to walk up or down, and they had to go 7 blocks to go in through the only entrance that was allowing people in to catch whatever train was still running. They disrupted the transit for that day. Why? This was all coming on the heels of the latest operation of the assault on Gaza, of the IDF going into Gaza. And myself, Robert Castle, and Kynan Thistlethwaite, all LaRouche youth members, some of which you'll hear from today, were there. And what we saw, this was some of the footage that we captured, was this elderly woman who was being dragged out of there, who was also part of the sit-in. There she is laughing and, And so I would say that the question is not necessarily just, what can I do? I think the question is, what am I not doing? And over the course of this, over the episode of today's show, and over the course of our guests, which we have 3 guests, we have Kynan Thistlethwaite, Harley Schlanger, and Professor Oliver Boyd Barrett. We'll be beginning with Harley Schlanger. But I hope to show you over the course of today's program some overview of what's actually happening that will give you inspiration and ideas as to what you should be doing right now instead of watching the MLB playoffs. So with that, Harley, why don't you take it away from us?
Okay, thank you, Jose. Well, 3 weeks ago today, a violent attack by Hamas into Israel put the world on the edge of a potential World War III. We were already on the edge of a World War III with the events going on in Ukraine and the NATO proxy war against Russia. But Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel instigated a policy which he called mighty vengeance, thereby plunging the situation in Southwest Asia into a new cycle of revenge, which has been going on for far too long. And with complete support of US President Joe Biden and most of America's NATO allies. There were 2 UN Security Council resolutions calling for a ceasefire, a humanitarian ceasefire, both vetoed by the United States. But there was a change that occurred at the UN on Friday, very significant development. And some people will say, well, what can the UN do? But what happened is it showed that the effect of this war is reaching the whole world. There was a UN resolution that passed which calls for an, quote, an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce, which includes the release of hostages, working toward a ceasefire, and condemns all acts of violence aimed at Palestinians and Israeli civilians. This came after 2 days of debate, intensive debate. It was introduced by the representative from Jordan, with the support of all the Arab neighbors of Israel. There were 50 co-sponsors, and when the vote finally took place, it was 120 for the resolution for a ceasefire, 14 against, shamefully including the United States, and 45 abstentions. I want to just give you an example of some of the discussion by showing what the ambassador from Ghana had to say. So if I could have the first post up there. This is from Ambassador Carolyn Opong Natir. She said, "We have a responsibility as an international community to help end the heartbreaking tragedies. We must find the fierce agency to support the two parties to resume and conclude a peace agreement and advance a two-state solution." Now, in saying that, the two-state solution is the reassertion of UN Resolution 242, which was mentioned before by Helga. There are many people around the world who were excited, or I should say happy, to see that the United Nations and the majority of the world is calling for such a solution. Among those who commented was the president of Brazil, Lula. Remember, Brazil introduced one of the first resolutions into the UN Security Council, which the US vetoed. But what Lula said is the question is not who is right and who is wrong. The war must be stopped. And he said, it's not a war, it's a genocide. Now, later in the program, we may want to discuss a little bit what the two-state solution is. But I want to go to the question of how you solve a problem like this. The question is not to relitigate past battles. There have been many atrocities committed on all sides. There have been violations of international law and of human rights. But the function of statecraft is to find solutions which benefit both parties by going above the literal situation, to look for answers in a higher realm of human creativity. And that involves negotiation and compromise, or what sometimes is called real diplomacy, not balance of power politics, as Henry Kissinger would argue, or the assertion of the right of a superpower to control the narrative, but actually addressing the concerns of the two parties involved. Now, what's been the response of the Biden administration? It's about as far removed from statesmanship as you could find. Not only support for the war, but cynically using his call for arms to Israel, a $14.5 billion request from the Congress, but using that by linking it to the Ukraine funding, which had run into significant problems because the Ukraine war is a losing proposition. It's an endless war, and it's costing billions of dollars. Biden's proposing another $60 billion. So by linking the two, he thought they could use what they believed would be the support of the American people for Israel to overcome the opposition to continued funding for Ukraine. That's the kind of cynicism that comes from the Blinken, Sullivan, Newland, and Biden crowd. Now, Biden has reasserted over and over he's 100% with Israel. There should be no negotiations. The U.S. vetoed the 2 resolutions for the UN Security Council and voted against the UN General Assembly resolution. And Biden has personally gone to Israel, met with Netanyahu, met with the war cabinet, and has issued statements of complete disrespect to the Palestinian people. If I can have the second post, I'll give you an example of one of these that shows his attitude. He was asked about the number of civilian deaths that are being reported by the Gaza health minister. And here's what Biden said. What they say to me is, I have no notion that the Palestinians are telling the truth about how many people are killed. I'm sure innocents have been killed, and it's the price of waging a war. I have no confidence in the number that the Palestinians are using. The idea of a number, arguing about a number, when it's unmistakably clear that there have been thousands of children who have been the victims of this Israeli aerial strikes. And now, by the way, the New York Times announced a half hour ago that it appears that the ground invasion has begun. But Biden was reflecting the views of his Secretary of State Blinken, who in turn reflects the outlook of Madeleine Albright, the murderous former Secretary of State, who, when asked on 60 Minutes about the 500,000 Iraqi children who died in the 1990s as a result of the sanctions against Iraq, said it was a hard decision to make, but it was worth it. 500,000 children, 4,000 or so in Gaza now, the children of Syria who were affected by the Caesar sanctions, the children of Afghanistan, the children of Yemen, the children of Libya. Wherever the U.S. war machine and NATO war machine has been unleashed, it's led to tragic consequences. So we're looking at this kind of attitude. And the question is, what do you do about it? Now, it's interesting that Biden was caught in a trap of his own making. On the one side, he said, we have to concern ourselves to some extent with humanitarian matters of the Palestinian people. And he said there are humanitarian considerations. But then he continues to express complete support for Israel. There's a contradiction there because Netanyahu said that the Israeli policy is mighty vengeance. Israeli military officials have said we have to exterminate Hamas, and others have said we can't concern ourselves with the civilian population, which is being used by Hamas as shields. So how do you have humanitarian concerns from Biden if you at the same time are supporting a war? There's a prominent Palestinian who was quoted in the New York Times who was asked about the ongoing onslaught. And he said, quote, "Is it a war against Hamas, really? Or is it a war against my kids?" Now, there are also conflicting reports on whether Biden may be delaying a ground invasion. If in fact that's what he's trying to do, and the New York Times is right that it started, he's been completely unsuccessful in that. But at the same time, his administration insists that he has no input in Israeli planning, and he continues to support Netanyahu. Well, if you want to have a humanitarian concern, stop sending the weapons, cut off the support. Instead of $14.5 billion of new arms to Israel, stop it. There are things that can be done. Now, in the meantime, I'll just point out something parenthetically. Biden's support in the United States is undergoing a cataclysmic collapse. There was a poll reported, I think by NPR yesterday, which said among Democrats in the last 3 weeks, support for Biden has gone from 86% to 75%. That's since this situation began. Among independents from 39% to 35%, and overall from 41% to 37%. I think what we saw at Grand Central Station and what Jose was talking about in terms of what we're seeing on campuses is that there are a lot of people who are not willing to put the power of the United States on the side of a genocide against the people of Palestine. Now, The question then is, how do you get out of the box, out of the cycle of violence? And I know Kynan will be talking in a few minutes about Lyndon LaRouche's record. I just want to call a couple aspects of it to your attention. Because what Lynn always insisted on is you have to have a higher concept of statecraft, that you seek the resolution in the realm of mutual benefit, which includes a nonviolent approach, but also combines an understanding of history and culture, as well as economics as a science. Economics as the science of the means by which human population can increase the potential relative population density of man as a species, which means developing the science and technology which can increase the overall production of necessary goods, which can then be turned into means by which you generate new wealth for the future, for investment in research and development, most importantly, investment in education for the youth, in modern healthcare, in transportation, and so on. This is what how LaRouche approached statecraft, that it's not a question of cutting a deal and we'll give you this if you give us that. It's a question of looking at where we stand in civilization and coming up with what the Chinese are calling a win-win solution. The problem is that the British Empire, which has defined most of the ground by which diplomacy is shaped, began with a Hobbesian zero-sum game approach. One side wins, the other side loses. You make money, we lose money. Instead, we want to make money and have you lose it. The British Empire had a divide and conquer strategy from the middle of the 18th century on that's resulted in millions of deaths worldwide. And the way the British do it is they do it so they don't have to do the killing. They use the divisions. This is what Samuel Huntington, who for all intents and purposes is an exponent of this British geopolitics, what he called the clash of civilizations. You pit Muslims against Jews, Christians against Muslims, Muslims against Muslims, the Shia against the Sunni. And this is what was done in the Middle East during the period before and during World War I, with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the British and French dividing the region up in the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. Now, this is why we have these problems today. The idea that there's no higher human solution, but there's only the benefit of one party or the other. And if you can pit the two sides against each other, or the 3 or 4 or 5 sides against each other, then a power on top, namely an imperial power, can protect itself. And this is what we're seeing today with the intent of Blinken, Biden, and others to defend what they call the rules-based order. And it's amazing that they're not asked, who made these rules? What happened to the international law? What happened to the UN Resolution 242, which is part of the rules-based order? Why is no one demanding that that be followed? So you see on the one side the hypocrisy of the Anglo-American or transatlantic forces, as opposed to the potential that exists when human beings sit down and say, how do we provide a basis where each of us will benefit? Each party, each nation, each grouping has a benefit by working with the other. And this, for LaRouche, in terms of the Southwest Asia, his Oasis plan, which Helga mentioned, took a very simple question, which is what's one of the impediments for prosperity in the region? It's the lack of water. But you have oceans, the Mediterranean Sea, you have the Indian Ocean, you've got water all around it, and yet you have desert on the land. Well, LaRouche looked at what the Tennessee Valley Authority had proposed in the 1950s, based on what they did in Tennessee under Franklin Roosevelt in in the Depression, which is how do you manage water supplies in a way that's beneficial. And the idea LaRouche had is you dig canals from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea and the Red Sea to the Dead Sea. You line those canals with nuclear plants to desalinate the water and make an ample supply of water for all parties in the region. And this was the approach he took with the Oasis plan, which was actually incorporated in the economic annexes of the Oslo Agreement signed by Rabin and Arafat. So these kinds of advanced conceptions, that is what should guide statecraft, not you hit us, so we're going to hit you back. Now, the Schiller Institute has put out a proposal through the International Peace Coalition for a three-point approach to what must be done immediately that would move toward this implementation. And this is the global approach to ending the cycle of violence. Point number one, we demand the end of forced migration from Gaza. This is what the Israelis have insisted on, moving the population from the north to the south, in preparation for a land invasion. The Israelis are saying, well, we don't want to harm civilians, so we're going to tell them to leave. But where are they going to go? It's a small area. You're talking about 1 million people, and they're being shot at as they're moving. Where they're going in the south is being targeted, the hospitals, the transportation centers, and so on. So the first step is the end of the forced migration. The second step, we demand a ceasefire and an end to the daily killing by all means available. Let me just make a simple suggestion there. One of the ways that could be made clear is to stop shipping arms into the region. This idea of a $14.5 billion arms transfer program for Israel should be cut. And then the third point, if you can put that back up, please, is the UN must find ways to enforce Resolution 242. And this was the two-state solution. This includes the withdrawal of Israel's armed forces and a move away from all claims or states of belligerency, and instead respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area, and their right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threats or acts of force. Now, I'll just finish by saying that what I've been emphasizing these last 2 weeks in the discussions here at the Manhattan Project is LaRouche's idea that the reason you have these confrontations is there's someone playing the sides against each other from above. This has been the case, as I mentioned, since the end of World War I. In terms of international policies, it goes back to the launching of the whole idea of British geopolitics. But it's the ability of the corporate cartels through especially the media, but also through think tanks, through the spending in non-governmental organizations and so on, that plays on these conflicts. For what purpose? To prevent against an alternative coming into being. And what's important to note is that that alternative is here. The alternative that's already being organized is a non-dollar financial system. Not that the dollar is going to be thrown out, but that the ability to use the dollar as a weapon against development that will be backed up by the military power of NATO, that is what's ending now and has to end. We're seeing it in the statements coming from the Global South. We're seeing it coming from the discussion process going on at the United Nations, the fact that most of the Global South nations voted for this ceasefire resolution. And so it's from that standpoint that you see what the problem is. The problem is the United States and Western Europe working on a British geopolitical imperial game plan that's not in the interests of the American people or the people of Europe. And it's time for the people of the United States and Europe to say, we're not going to tolerate this kind of manipulation anymore. We're not going to tolerate our tax dollars, our work, and everything we do, and our future to go into these wars for the benefit of a small number of benefactors from the global corporate cartels. So that's what I wanted to present in an opening, and hopefully we'll have some time for discussion afterwards.
There we go. I was muted. Okay, there we go. I sure hope so too, Harley. Next, we are now going to hear from Professor Boyd Barrett. Professor Boyd Barrett is a professor emeritus at Bowling Green State University and California State Polytechnic University, also a member of the International Peace Coalition. So, Professor, please give us your thoughts and anything you'd like to contribute to this discussion.
Thank you so much, Jose, and thank you so much, Harley, for your brilliant review of the current situation and the background to that situation. And I think there are so many ways into this. I have to be highly selective, and I'm going my way into it right now. I'm going to focus on Israel. What is Israel? And I'm going to propose the idea that whatever Israel was back in 1970, back in the 1940s, leading up to the award of acknowledgement of Israel as a state, I'm going to propose that whatever Israel was in 1948 changed radically after 1953, which is when the British and the Americans overthrew the democratic regime under, I should say, government under Mohammad Mossadegh of Iran, and threw that country back into a state of a police state, definitely an autocracy, but also a police state. Why is that significant? Is the question. Because it's at that point we see that the United States transitions its monetary support, manipulation, divide and rule games that it learned from the British, from Iran, from at that point in 1953, just a few years, of course, after after Israel is established as a state, Iran is seen to be the proxy power for the United States in the Middle East, with a primary focus on controlling the Middle East, because, of course, it was and still is if not the single major source of fossil fuel. The United States at that time being fairly heavily dependent on imports of oil from the Middle East, less so many decades later, but still in need of controlling the Middle East, because if you control the sources of fossil fuel, then you hope to control the world. So so number one, it's about empire. Number two, it's, as we shall see, as we are seeing, empire has no morality. There's no point in, well, there is a point, but to charge empires with being immoral is neither here nor there, because they don't care. It's not about morality for them, although sometimes it may be about wanting to seem to be moral. That's difficult for the United States. On the one hand, it it conjures up the notion of humanitarian interventionism and uses that as a tool of empire. And then in other contexts such as Libya and Syria and every few years in Israel, we see that it really just doesn't care about numbers. Hardy referred, of course, to that 1996 statement from Madeleine Albright, in which he says, well, 500,000 kids, they're dead now in Iraq because of our sanctions. Well, we think it's worth it. Yeah, it's and for the United States, it is worth it because it preserves U.S. hegemonic power, and the U.S. whatever U.S. administrations get into power, they are there not to serve the U.S. people, but they are there to serve the plutocratic and corporate interests that every day more control the puppets in the U.S. Congress. So it's kind of interesting then to go back to this notion. So Iran was the U.S. policeman for the Middle East for a long time. It's a beautiful economic device, this business of proxies, because they do all the work for you. You give them money and weapons, but they put all the back effort into serving your interests. And but of course, ultimately people rise up. Ultimately, the people you oppress, you suppress, you murder, you torture. You do that for long enough, and amazing, isn't it? People get annoyed with being tortured and murdered and suppressed and harassed and marginalized. They get actually quite angry, and and when they don't have other options, they will do things that appear to be to those of us sitting in comfort before our lattes in Starbucks, do things that seem to be rather grotesque. Erdogan the other day, in the process of trying to reestablish his own empire, the Ottoman Empire, now posing as the savior of the Muslim world, he rightly calls into question this presumption that Hamas is best understood as a terrorist organization rather than an organization of liberation. I mean, I do think that's. I think we definitely should question that and should interrogate that statement. But there's definitely a dividing line between wars of terrorism and wars of liberation in a context of unbelievable oppression. You have to expend some time listening to voices like, for example, Eva Bartlett. I heard the other day being interviewed by Scott Ritter, or Abby Martin, who put together a really interesting, powerful, moving documentary on Gaza just in 2019. And you have to actually see the evidence of the cruelty, the brutality, the absence of morality, the absence of common human sense before one steps in to judge the actions of those who would wish to rid themselves of oppression. You have to see them in that context. And so in the case of Iran, eventually, the people did rise up. There were two strong factions behind that successful revolution of 1979 that got rid of the U.S. puppet, the Shah of Iran, and installed what ultimately became, as we know, a theocratic Shia Islamic state. the revolution had embraced a very strong, very left-wing secular movement as well, which ultimately, probably as a result of some form of U.S. meddling, I would expect, in those years of 1979, 1980. Ultimately, the left wing was put down, and many tens of thousands of people lost their lives in that particular civil conflict, because empire always prefers to deal with religious fanatics than to deal with rational secular movements. They pose the greatest threat. That's why it's so easy for the United States, for the collective West, to use, to manipulate, to penetrate radical Islamist movements, such as, for the past 100 years, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is largely it was used to foment unrest in Syria in 1980, and then again in Syria in 2010, 2011, and then you got Qatar and the UAE and the Saudi Arabia, and of course, once again, the United States supporting jihadist movements, some of them associated with Al-Qaeda, as in the case of al-Nusra, for example. Because these people don't believe in nations anyway. They believe in the caliphate or similar kinds of concept, and they think that they're, and perhaps they actually are, promoting their own interests by collaborating with imperial interests, because of course empires don't care about, in fact they want to suppress the rise of national movements anywhere, just as the Bush doctrine of 2002 reiterated that of course it is still very much formal U.S. foreign policy to crush any competition to U.S. power and influence around the world, whether it be global or whether it be regional. And so with the Iranian Revolution of 1979, we see Iran up until that point had been a massive beneficiary of U.S. anything the Shah of Persia dreamt up that he could want from U.S. military largesse, he got because he was just so useful. And then after the successful Iranian Revolution of 1979, the United States then anoints Israel. Israel now becomes the U.S. policeman, and that's what it is. That's what it is still today. The U.S. policeman. The power that was allowed to develop its own nuclear weapons force. People say it's got 200 nuclear warheads. I think it's far more than that. And it hasn't signed, it's never been part of the non-proliferation treaty. Iran, by the way, Iran, which has no nuclear weapons. It does have a nuclear power program, a civilian nuclear power program. It has always worked as far as it reasonably could be expected to do within the framework of international law, so far as the development of its nuclear power program is concerned, despite 2 decades of idiotic Israeli and U.S. propagandizing with a view to suggesting that Iran is a, quote, nuclear threat, which is absolute nonsense, which it never has been and is still today not so. This is the kind of background that, of course, the Western mainstream media very rarely, if ever, choose to focus on. For the Western mainstream media, the story always begins at the latest manifestation of local resistance against empire. That's when the story starts. The story starts with what they do to upset our civilized order. So our young people, people who are not particularly educated in these matters, that's all they see. They see what they are told is the first aggressive act to which the empire must respond in order to preserve sanity and put civilization back into place. That's the reality that was presented to us in 2011 in Syria, when all of a sudden the world is told that Bashar Assad, the dictator, there are always dictators. We never have dictators, apparently, in the West, even though Western democracies just come up with one terrible solution after another, whereas supposed autocracies like Russia and China actually produce very good, solid, sound, durable solutions time after time after time again. But so Bashar Assad is, he's provoked. There are local uprisings staged by the Muslim Brotherhood, and as is often the case in this particular playbook, seeming to collaborate and to support genuine protest movements of a more secular kind, as we saw in Ukraine in 2014. From that point on, we see this massive funneling of support, supposedly in favor of democracy in Syria, which is laughable, of course, because a lot of this money is coming from Middle Eastern autocrats. This funneling of funding into jihadist movements that ultimately slide into the formation of ISIS and the ISIS Caliphate, which had a few years of success over a vast swath of territory of both Iraq and Iran, even though it was, and without question, was a brutal organization, and these were brutal times. The United States and the collective West still prefer to direct their attention and their anger against the Assad regime, and were tardy in the extreme in handling the ISIS threat to Middle Eastern security. Well, where am I going with all of this? I think the principal lesson here is that there's no understanding of anything unless we see the history. And when we look at the history, and to be brutally bottom line about all of this, what we see is empire. We see the continuation of European empire, the mantle of empire adopted by the United States following its victory over Germany and Japan in World War II. It's victory, in other words, over the German Empire and over the Japanese Empire, in collaboration with the British Empire and with the French Empire and with the Dutch Empire, with the Italian, and this collective of empires. The United States in the lead, followed by these poodle empires, the supposedly defunct empires that nonetheless continue to accomplish their imperial objectives by working alongside Russia and then picking up the crumbs from Washington's plate, secure in their dog leashes. That attach them, regardless of almost any conceivable event, still attached to the food chain from Washington. And now, let's just try to put this finally in this final context. The most important thing in terms of timeline is that the two crises that are now appearing in the Middle East. One, of course, is the crisis of the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza and the very negative knock-on effects this will have for the Palestinians in the West Bank and for the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, All three of those groups are now doomed. Unless, although I personally am very unhopeful that we will see very meaningful address from Saudi Arabia, from Egypt, from even from Turkey, the presumed saviors and guardians of Muslim interest, but who most of the time work hand in glove with Washington when it.
Professor, just real quick, I got to give you one more minute here to wrap up. We can continue this in the Q&A. I just got somebody else who's coming on the line. I want to make sure our next presenter has the time. But please,
absolutely,
take another
perfect. And I'm sorry if I've gone over. So I just quickly say the main concept here for us to bear in mind is this concept of multipolarity. It's the concept of the BRICS. It's the concept the development of new alliances, which the formation is moving at a very strong pace now. We have reasonable hope that we are, in concrete terms, moving towards a de-dollarized world that is spearheaded by organizations that represent the global South, a term which we should now be calling the global majority, because within BRICS we have China, we have Russia, we have India, we have over half of the world's total population. So however gloomy Israel at the moment may seem, this is one step on the path to victory and the death of Western Empire.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. Our next speaker will be Kynan Thistlethwaite, who will be presenting something on Lyndon LaRouche. He is a veteran LaRouche youth member who has been participating in a lot of the actions recently. So, Kynan, please go right ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you so much. Just want to thank Harley and Professor Barrett for their remarks as well. But I'll just begin that, this conflict that we see erupting in Southwest Asia has established a need for an immediate ceasefire. And many nations, such as China and Russia, which Professor Barrett pointed to, have called for cooler heads to prevail. And the carnage in Gaza is devastating. And thankfully, we have seen some large protests in the United States and elsewhere condemning the brutality and lack of concern for Palestinians. Jose and I were just at the protest at Grand Central Station, which actually shut it down. So that's important to note. But what's evident is that we must have a paradigm shift in the world, one based on what Helga Zepp-LaRouche has called for in the form of a new security and development architecture for all the nations in the world. I've actually recently taken some time to read a policy paper written by Lyndon LaRouche on the subject of economic development in Southwest Asia. And if you could put the title up, it's called Saudi Arabia in the Year 2023. It was written in June of 1983, 40 years ago, at the suggestion of some of Lynn's Arab friends. I'd like to indicate some aspects of this policy paper, particularly how he outlines his development plan for Southwest Asia. So to start, if you could go to the next slide with the quote, he actually considers Saudi Arabia within the Arab world as a whole. He says, quote, "From the western border of Iran to the Atlantic, and from the southern border of Turkey into the African Sahel, there exists an Arab world so interdependent that no economist can consider competently the sovereign interests of any one Arab state without studying the political and economic interdependencies of that world as a whole. It is a world which pivots on Egypt, a world whose existence is defended to the east by Iraq and to the west by Morocco." So you could just put that down now. But it's within that strategic setting, the entire region as a whole, that the development of Saudi Arabia is considered. Now, with that said, why don't we take a look at Lynn's intelligent approach to the question of Southwest Asia, particularly how it relates to Israel and Palestine in what later became known as the Oasis Plan. So if you could go to the next slide, here you can see a satellite view of the region. You notice that much of the area is a desert, and that much of the vegetation and greener parts are concentrated on the riverbanks of the region. So what Lynn proposed to certain circles that he knew in Israel, and among some Palestinians, of course, and Arabs, was that a political solution can only be arrived at if there was an economic self-interest of both parties in the region. And because of the arid nature of the region, which you see by that satellite view, there wasn't enough water from the nearby river systems available for the total population. But as you can see on the area is surrounded by seawater in the Mediterranean, which you could actually transfer through a series of intelligently placed canals to the rest of the population. But the problem arises, you could put that down now, by the way. The problem arises when you consider that much of the water is salt water, and it cannot be consumed. So we can now go back to the paper, and Lynn says this, quote, "To restore this desertified region of Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia into a fertile region of habitation does not require the catastrophic return of the Ice Age." And he's actually referring to, 7,000, 8,000 years in the last great glaciation period. These areas were not deserts at the time. That's what he's referring to. But anyways, it doesn't require the return of an ice age, but most essentially, water to sustain plant life. A small portion of the water required for this purpose is available with aid of large-scale engineering projects, which enable us to make better use of existing water supplies. A more extensive conquest of the desert will require other means, chiefly large-scale desalination of seawater to increase qualitatively the total supply of fresh water for the regions involved. There are principally three technological means required for this general program of increasing absolutely, qualitatively, the freshwater throughput of the regions. First, abundant cheap energy supplies, to an extent and with a quality not available except with reliance upon nuclear and related technologies. Second, developments under the heading of qualitative advances in relativistic physics, to make the necessary development and economic application of nuclear technologies efficient. Third, the use of large-scale development of plant growth to create the climatological basis for new weather systems, through which much of the fresh water supplied to each part of the entire region is reacquired as rainfall in the same and adjoining region. Now, if you could go to the next slide, which gives a view of the Oasis plan. What he proposed essentially is what Harley went through, that a series of small, high-temperature nuclear reactors could be exported from the advanced sector nations and placed along the shores of the Mediterranean, and including in newly built canals, as you can see there in the vicinity of the Dead Sea. And that's what's labeled as the Red Dead Sea Canal. But the reactors, aside from providing energy to the region, it would also allow you to purify the water from the Mediterranean through a process called desalination, where you essentially heat the saline water and condense the vapor into fresh water. That was how the Oasis plan would function. The deserts of the region would be conquered, and from there you could establish new cities along the center of the newly irrigated areas. So this would be a development corridor, essentially. But there was also a problem, you could put that down, which was that with fission, even with some of the more advanced reactors at the time, such as thorium reactors, there was a high cost for desalinating water in the region. So how would this be solved? For one, Glenn emphasizes in the paper that there would need to be the emergence of commercial nuclear fusion, thermonuclear fusion, as a prime energy source for the world through international crash programs and credit made available by lending financial institutions. And of course, some of our viewers may be aware, but that's the fourth law of LaRouche's, the four laws. But there was also another development which would lead to cheaper methods of desalination, which was Lyndon LaRouche's Strategic Defense Initiative, made official policy by Ronald Reagan on March 23rd, 1983. So with the SDI in mind, this actually leads us to the crux of what Lynn was thinking at the time. For those unaware, the SDI was essentially a plan to develop new anti-ballistic missile technologies at the moment of heightened tensions between the US and the Soviet Union over the placement of Pershing II missiles in West Germany to counter the SS-20s in East Germany that the Soviets had placed. And I'm sure, Professor Barrett and Harley, they can tell you how close the world was to nuclear war at that point in our history. But if you could pull up the next slide, this is a mass pamphlet that was produced by the LaRouche organization in July of 1977. Sputnik of the 70s, the science behind the Soviets' beam weapon. The Soviets had actually developed new anti-ballistic missile capabilities, which were based on new physical principles. And Lynn had actually defined these new principles as the development of what he termed relativistic beam technologies, which were particle beams, microwave beams, and plasma technologies that would essentially render modern thermonuclear weapons as impotent and obsolete, as Reagan had noted in his speech announcing it. So this was a plan for the world to avoid thermonuclear war, which was very real at the time, and it's even much more of a threat today. But now let's go back again to Saudi Arabia in the year 2023. So he says here, there can be a qualitative improvement in projectable benefits through developments in relativistic physics. Such latter developments partly overlap and also parallel fusion technologies development. The development of strategic and tactical beam weapon systems against strategic and tactical missiles, for example, will tend to force this latter development of high-energy relativistic beam systems applicable to industrial tasks. The greater effect of these frontier developments on the economies of the entire world will be much greater, more profound, than the effects of the 18th century's development of the heat-powered machine and the coming of electricity into general use in industrialized economies around the beginning of the present century. Unless threatening global catastrophes prevent this, the coming 25 to 30 years will witness the greatest, most profound technological revolution in all human history to date. It is in that context that the Arab conquest of the desert is situated. That was how Lynn viewed the SDI, as a security and economic development package all wrapped up into one. The SDI would be the basis for a new laser industrial revolution, which would emerge from developing new anti-missile capabilities, but it would ultimately spread to industrialize the developing sector nations, to Africa, South America, and so on. I should note that this was only one policy paper that was written by Lynn at the time. He had also written a proposal to develop for a longer-term development plan of Israel. He had also written something for Argentina and also Morocco. So, we can think about, while he's developing the SDI, why is he writing all these other economic development programs for other nations? I mean, after all, the SDI is just a military proposal, right? Well, from what we just read, we can see that it wasn't just a military proposal. And Lynn thought about it in a completely different way. So, coming back to the current conflict that we see erupting in the Gaza Strip, we have to take a look above the battlefield itself to really conceptualize, how do we really end this killing, this bloody cycle of vengeance? Let's consider, what are we going to give the people of Palestine and Israel after the conflict ends? Hopefully, if it ends. There are over 1 million young people in Palestine who were not even born in the last election cycle that occurred in the region of 2005. So picture yourself in the mindset of an 18-year-old Palestinian today. How would you be feeling if you were being bombed for the actions of a minority in your nation? What outlook on life would you have? You'd be totally miserable and pessimistic, probably. So I think that just shows that it's our job to provide something to the people of Palestine, to the people of Israel, and Southwest Asia, a future in which they actually have a purpose in life. And, we can take sides all we want, and we can call the other out for their crimes, but that's really not going to work if we want this war to end. So Lyndon LaRouche's long-term development plans for Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Southwest Asia that I've outlined, they have to be implemented, and we should all verse ourselves in it if we want to stop this drive towards World War III. So I think I'll just end it there, and yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Kynan, for that great presentation. Now we are going to begin our discussion. We have plenty of questions. We also have a surprise report from somebody who conducted an intervention on Hillary Clinton. But before we go to that, and as they get ready, I want to give people a response to kind of respond to each other. Harley, I want to start with you first. Do you have a response, whether it's to what Kynan presented or what Professor Boyd Barrett has presented here, and your thoughts?
Well, briefly, I want to strongly second the point that Professor Boyd Barrett made about the importance of actually knowing history. The problem is that most people don't know that they, at least in the United States, that they're living in what we would call a transatlantic or Anglo-American empire. This is what LaRouche always insisted, is that much of the theory behind the empire comes from the British geopolitics of the 20th century. But it's the American military power and now NATO military power that's enforcing it. But what's clear is that the hybrid warfare capabilities of that empire blind the people who live in the imperial state to the fact that they're in an empire. And they think their relative prosperity and security comes from being innately superior. And conversely, that the poverty and insecurity of the nations that are subordinated to the empire is based on their inferiority. And it's this kind of racism, which we correctly identify from the Nazis in World War II. But if you look at the policy going on toward the Palestinians today, you see that same attitude, that same outlook. And it's the ignorance of history. And I think that's one of the most important points that we can make. Now, as for what Kynan presented, I think it's extremely important to see young people like Kynan and yourself, Jose, taking on the responsibility to keep developing the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche when it comes to physical economy. As I pointed out, the solution to these crises is a coordination in thinking between the highest conception of history and culture and science, and applying that to the economics of human existence. And so I think what Kynan was covering is extremely important. We have the LaRouche Legacy Project, which is going to be having a digital library of all of these works by LaRouche, and I would really encourage people to take the time to explore them.
Okay, thank you, Harley, and Professor Boyd Barrett. Oh, wow. Yeah, we've got lots of questions. So, Professor Boyd Barrett, I'll give you an opportunity here if you wanted to respond to anything you heard today so far.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Jose. I'd just like to reinforce what Hardy has just said about the role of racism, the sense that we find in the collective West of superiority, which it's the result of imperial plunder. So if you rob other people's lands, if you massacre millions and tens of millions of people and then move into their lands and take their stuff, yes, you actually build up quite a lot of wealth. And then you apply that wealth, you invest it in new enterprises, and many of those enterprises will generate further wealth. And you can sit back if you want and pat yourself on the back and say, this is because I am just so incredibly smart and wise. And look, I've spent some of my money allowing a few people over there to philosophize or to engage in theology. How wonderful am I? And of course, it's total bullshit. This is all the result of plunder. And now we are approaching the day of historical reckoning. And I think with respect to, in response to Kainan's very, very interesting, inspiring presentation, I just want to pick up on this notion of development, of respect for the potential of technology, wisely applied to real problems of the people, without concern for the generation of profit. And also to see hope between that approach and to see hope in the sort of philosophy that underlines China's Belt and Road initiative. One might say this is a form of empire of development, but it may be an empire of development, but it's not accompanied by the build-up of military force, or at least it wasn't until the West started threatening to conquer China. Now, of course, China has had to respond militarily in preparation for what will surely be an attempt to bring down China using Taiwan as a proxy. It won't work, but that's another conversation. And my only fear is that since China's own capitalistic turn, whether we can see within Chinese governance sufficient hope of a bringing together a synchronization, a synchronicity between its economic brilliance, its industrial brilliance, and its recent communistic heritage, and its anti-imperialist heritage. We want to see those two things come together in its relationship to the rest of the world and in whatever guidance it can supply to the further development of the BRICS. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let's get this Q&A period started. I'm going to put us here with a question to get us going, and then we will go into the live report. Now, here is the question. This comes in from a viewer. Okay, so here it goes. A comment. Islamic fundamentalism is a tool of British intelligence. It was deployed to bring Khomeini into power over the course of 1979. It was coordinated with the Pakistan-Afghanistan caper of 1979, directed by Brzezinski, operating out of the Trilateral Commission and Columbia University, which is, that's funny. Anyway, over 40 years, this danger has been activated many times, and the United States has spent over $3 trillion in all expenditures to the ostensible effect of fighting the same Taliban it first created, then yielding Afghanistan to the Taliban after all of this was over. Now, the question is, the actual purpose of the military campaign all along? Was this the actual purpose of the military campaign all along? Destruction as a method of imperial governance. I want to go to Harley first on this, and then we'll go to Professor Boyd Barrett. So Harley?
Well, let me start by pointing out that the identification of Zbigniew-Brzezinski in this is key, because it was Brzezinski, as part of the Carter government, who introduced this idea of the arc of crisis as a clever strategy for weakening and destroying the Soviet Union. The idea being that you can use the area to the southern border of the Soviet Union, where there's a large Islamic population, to generate a fundamentalist movement that would move against the so-called atheistic communist state. Now, Brzezinski, who's given credit for that, really isn't the author. It goes back to Bernard Lewis, who is a British historian and Arabist who developed this idea. And of course, this goes back much further in terms of the divide and conquer strategy. But the initial idea behind it was to weaken and destroy the Soviet Union, but to use it as, look at the area, look at Afghanistan. What's the crucial point on Afghanistan? Some people say, well, there are a lot of strategic metals and raw materials and this and that. Well, again, this is where geopolitics comes in, the merger of geography and empire. Afghanistan was the area of the great game in the mid-19th century of conflict between the British Empire and the Russian Empire. Most of these crises that we see in the world today, whether it's the Near East, Southwest Asia, Ukraine, the Indo-Pacific, these are areas that were part of the British Empire. And so when you ask what's the purpose of the military operation, it was to protect the power of setting up terms of trade, finance, and international relations to defend the empire. And that's what we're seeing today, only today it's called the unipolar empire. And it's being deployed to defeat the potential to not only break up the unipolar empire, but to create a new order that, in a sense, it's often called multipolar. But beyond that, it has to become a human order, which takes up the responsibility for the betterment of all people, of all nations. So I think these wars we're seeing are the end phase of a collapse of an empire. And you can find reasons for it all over the place, but the reasons are the subordinate factor. The primary factor is the preservation of an empire.
Okay, Professor Barrett?
Yeah, just to build up on what Harley has just been telling us, and also going back to the original question, absolutely the British did learn how to manipulate and to radicalize religious movements in order to divide and to rule, to create problems for local political power, and when necessary to subvert local political power. So the British learned how to manipulate the Muslim Brotherhood to keep secular power in Egypt unsettled. The Americans very much applied the similar kind of lessons following the Russian invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the same year, incidentally, as the Iranian revolution right next door. These two countries are neighbors to one another. And in fomenting resistance to the Russian invasion, or the Russian occupation, I should say, of Afghanistan for a 10-year period, the Americans learned, along again with the British, learned how to manipulate Sunni Islam in Afghanistan as a political and military weapon against Russian control of Afghanistan. And then we also saw later on these radicalized movements have a life of their own. So they don't just disappear when you no longer need them. They continue to flourish, as we saw in Afghanistan. The radical Islamists didn't disappear when the Russians left Afghanistan. They continued. They formed the Taliban, and ultimately, of course, as we see in 2001 and the U.S. and occupation of Afghanistan, we continue to see the continuing play of radical Islam or radicalized Islam. We even had American professors who were paid by the State Department to produce religious textbooks, Islamic religious textbooks that would be used in order to inspire young Afghani men to blend their religion with methods of terrorism and military threat. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you, Professor. As you can see, we've got on one of our interventionists here, Robert Castle, who I will give him the floor in just a minute. If you're just tuning in here, this is the Saturday Town Hall show, moderated by myself, Jose Vega. I've got a wonderful panel here, and we are in the last half hour of our show. We've got lots of questions. I want to try and address them, so keep that in mind as we go forward here. But I do want Robert on because, well, maybe I don't necessarily need to give him an introduction. I think people may have seen this next video that we are going to play here now. But before I play it, Robert, why don't you tell me what was going on at what we're about to see? This was an intervention done against Hillary Clinton. Set the stage here. What's about to happen? What's going on?
Closed door event that was, my friend Simon and I were the first and second on the wait list, and we happened to get escorted into the room just in time to make our comments. But this was at the School of International Policy Affairs. I might be getting that wrong, but at Columbia. And essentially, this was a panel on the discussion of the UN Declaration of Universal Human Rights, specifically focusing on Eleanor Roosevelt's role in bringing this this document to fruition. And this was only a few days after the Oval Office speech that Joe Biden had given. Our intention was to try to have a sort of a more rational or reasonable exchange with Hillary Clinton. During the Q&A, we were informed as we went in that there wasn't going to be an open Q&A session. So I sort of decided to strike while the iron was hot and speak to her.
Okay, so let's go right here to that video.
I can't help be struck by the hypocrisy of this.
Two more people to hear from.
I'm sorry.
You have a chance. Well, I'm not sorry. You sit down.
I know you're not sorry. That's the point. The hypocrisy of this speech. The hypocrisy of the fact that what do you have? Can you please make a statement about President Joe Biden's speech? This is a clearly warmongering speech. President Joe Biden is calling for $100 billion of funding for Israel, Taiwan, and Ukraine, and we're supposed to just bundle these together and pretend like we're going to rush to World War III, and we're all just going to let Hillary Rodham Clinton sit here. Okay.
I'm sorry. This is not the way to have a conversation.
I'm sorry.
If you want to have a conversation, you're welcome to come talk to me afterwards.
You can sit here. Okay, right. You're gonna wait for me, right? Please, I do not believe you.
And I will listen to you, and I will respond to you.
I do not believe you. Respectfully, I do not believe you. And the fact of the matter is that the American people's voice are what need to be heard.
Yeah, they are being heard.
Because our president is not speaking for the American people, and neither are you.
That's your opinion. That's your opinion.
Yes, that's my opinion.
Well, then sit down. We've heard your opinion. Thank you very much. Now we're going to turn to people who are on the front lines.
I'm not going to stop
working on behalf of human rights.
I'm going to exercise my free speech.
But it's not free speech when you are disrupting everybody else's opportunity to speak.
This is free speech, everyone. This is free speech. That is not free speech. This is people constructing narratives that are openly hypocritical. I'm sorry. The incredible hypocrisy.
Maybe you could actually
went with Eleanor Roosevelt to bring this Declaration of the Rights of Man, John Foster Dulles was involved with the CIA.
Oh, yeah. Well, you're brilliant in your historical cherry picking.
The Pinochet regime.
Oh,
Please, could you please inform me about the United States
Okay,
involvement in these historical things?
we're going to move on
Miss
to
Clinton, will you
Frank
denounce
Medisha,
Joe
who's
Biden?
actually on
Will
the
you
front lines
denounce Joe
fighting for
Biden's
human
speech?
rights, not just yelling about it. So, Frank, I want to turn to you because you are from Uganda, and Uganda's 2023 Anti-Homosexuality Act criminalizes LGBTI conduct in Uganda.
Push us to World War III.
Oh,
Do you
please.
understand? It's not about Israel and Palestine. It's not it's not football. This isn't football. It's not Team America.
Well, I'm sorry, but some of us are on Team America despite our flaws and our problems.
Yes, that's me.
And some of us, every person on this stage.
You have to stop right now. You have to stop.
Wait, I want to say one thing. Every person on this stage has risked their life, their income, their reputation, their careers, and what have you done other than stand up and disrupt?
I need you to
I will put my record and these women's records and Frank's records against you any day of the year.
I'll respond. What I have done is I have asked Hillary Rodham Clinton to denounce the president's openly warmongering, suicidal, idiotic speech.
And I've given my answer. I will not do that. So that's the end of our conversation. But I'll still meet you outside. But you're done
right now.
Okay, Frank.
Frank has been. She said she'll meet me outside.
Okay, come.
And I'm sure she met you outside, and you had a reasonable discussion with her. Right, Robert? Is that what happened? Oh, Robert, I think we're losing you. Go ahead. We can hear you now.
Can you hear me? Okay,
Yep.
great. No, yeah, of course she didn't. She didn't come outside. She didn't. I think I saw it flash through her eyes for a second. She realized she was a mere mortal, but I think she probably managed to suppress that realization fairly quickly and refrain from coming to speak to me as a human being. Am I still coming through all right?
Yeah, no, you are. And I just want to say, I bring that up, that intervention up in this context right now for our audience at home who may be wondering, what is it I can do? When I opened the show, I said to people that this may be your first time coming on our show. This may be your first time ever seeing anything political. And if that is you, I want to directly address you and say there are things you can do. You are not impotent. You don't have to let the waves of history crash on you. You can create the waves. And I bring on Robert as one example of what you can do. And that's kind of where I want to take this discussion. Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, I'd just like to follow up with that briefly. I mean, I could make a personal remark, which is just to say that, of course, like everyone else, the past few years have been really hard for me. And it was the realization that there was something that I could do, and that it was not just that I could, but that it was actually necessary. That was the resolution to a lot of the sort of personal problems, in the sense that I discovered a kind of purpose. And with regard to that, I'd like to just read something very briefly, and then I'll pass the mic on. This is from Martin Luther King's address at the Riverside Church on April 4th in 1967. This was when he had, I believe this was his sort of, when he really concretely came out in public as an advocate to bring an end to the war in Vietnam. And he's referring to a sort of coalition of religious leaders that had drafted some kind of document, I believe. And the first sentence, "A time comes when silence is betrayal," is quoted from their statement. And then he goes on, "And that time has come for us in relation to Vietnam. The truth of these words is beyond doubt, but the mission to which they call us is a most difficult one. Even when pressed by the demands of inner truth, men and women do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in time of war. Nor does the human spirit move without great difficulty against all the apathy of conformist thought within one's own bosom and in the surrounding world. And of course, today, that's very much at play. Moreover, when the issues at hand seem as perplexing as they often do in the case of this dreadful conflict, we are always on the verge of being mesmerized by uncertainty. But we must move on. And some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found that the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony. But we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision, but we must speak. And I think in particular, that last statement that King makes is extremely important, because when you take it upon yourself to speak and you realize that you don't have, Kynan's presentation on the Oasis plan is obviously extremely profound and something that we should carry forward. But when you as an individual make the decision yourself to speak, there will be a voice of doubt saying, well, who am I? I couldn't do Hillary Clinton's job or whatever. But that's not a truthful perception of it, because I think King was absolutely correct that we must speak out in all humility in saying that whatever the correct solution is, we know that it's not the murder of thousands of children. And that is the thing that we have to really just continue to communicate every hour and day moving forward, is that whatever the correct way forward is, it's not what's happening right now, because what's happening right now is that the world is becoming increasingly gripped by the delusion that you can exact vengeance on large groups of innocent people for the crimes of small minorities of people who have control over weapon systems. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Robert. I do want to give an opportunity for Harley or Professor Barrett or even Kynan, because Kynan is another intervener, to respond to this. And as you do that, Harley, I will be pulling up in the background something for people to do right this very minute. There is a petition floating around put forward by Humanity for Peace, and the Schiller Institute is a big sponsor of this petition. Now, I'm going to pull up that petition while you give any responses you have, Harley, and then we'll go to Professor Barrett and Kynan if they have any responses to the intervention that we just saw or the intervention process as a whole. But yes, and if you do want to do something this minute, you watching this program right now, I will pull up the petition for you, and the moderator in the chat will send a link to it right now. But Harley, please, any response?
Yes, Robert's quoting of Martin Luther King on this question of not being able to remain silent is really crucial. I was reading last night the Leah Rabin biography of her husband called Our Life, His Legacy. And repeatedly, she calls out religious leaders and the people of Israel for their silence when, after Rabin shook hands with Arafat, after they made the Oslo Accord, the Netanyahu crowd threatened his life. They attacked Rabin as a violator of Jewish law. They created an environment where his assassination could take place. And among the things she said is that silence is not allowable in these circumstances. And she said about religious leaders, they should call out the hatred. They should do something about it. The ball's in their court. They should oust those irresponsible people who are ready to kill, to whom land is more sacred than a human life. Had people done what Leah Rabin was calling for back in 1995, that is, given up the silence and called them out and acted on it, we wouldn't have this situation today in Gaza. The same way, had people acted on what Martin Luther King called upon in 1967, we could have avoided the incredible human loss and catastrophe of the Vietnam War. So, this idea of acting and having the courage to speak and do things, this is a life and death situation for humanity, and no one is too small to make an impact. But I commend Robert. I think that was an excellent way of standing up to Hillary Rodham Clinton. And now I think several hundreds of thousands or millions of people have seen that, and they've seen her lying hypocrisy, because it was clear to anyone who saw that she wasn't going to meet you afterwards.
Okay, thank you, Harley. Just before I go to you, Professor Barrett and Kynan, I have the petition here, and the petition is now also in the chat. I just want to read to you a couple sentences from this petition for people to sign. It's called the Urgent Call to World Leaders to End Wars, especially nuclear war. And it starts, esteemed leaders of nations worldwide, we, the undersigned concerned citizens of the world, join together in this petition to urgently call for decisive action to achieve lasting peace and security for all humanity. The current state of global conflicts demands immediate attention, and we implore you to address our clear demands for a peaceful and secure future. And our demands are as follows. 1, immediate ending of all funding and weapons to Ukraine. 2, convene immediate unconditional peace talks. 3, dissolution of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, colloquially known as NATO. 4, creation of a new international security architecture. And if you'd like to know what each of those points are, you can click on the petition in the chat to read the entire petition and add your name to the list. You will be joining ex-presidents, congressmen, officials, government officials, activists, leaders worldwide. You will be adding your voice to a force right now that is mounting a global resistance of peace. And you can be a part of that if you want to do something right this very second. So with that, Professor, do you have any comments in regards to the interventions process?
Yes. Thank you. I think Robert and Hardy had some extremely inspiring words just now. I want to say this, and with a view to ending my contribution on as positive a note as I can, but it's also a challenge. First of all, acknowledging the fact that we right now, today, this instant, 12:45 p.m. my time in California, we face potential nuclear annihilation from three fronts. It could occur in the context of a Muslim world uprising in protest against the genocide of Gaza. It could occur as a result of some US fabricated pretext for war against Iran, which would have to bring in Russia, which has superior nuclear technology, by the way, superior, that is, to our own. And the potential for war, for nuclear annihilation that still continues to exist with respect to the war between the United States and Russia over Ukraine being the NATO proxy for war. If we survive any of that, and it's a fairly big if, then we continue, hopefully with great speed, towards a reconfiguration of the world order under the leadership, for the moment, because the United Nations seems incapable of providing this kind of leadership. It's been so penetrated and ideologized by neoliberalism and neocons. If under the leadership of organizations like the BRICS, Shanghai Collaboration Organization, and the like, and we de-dollarize the world's economy, and we do enter a new multipolar era, it is not too soon. In fact, it's already too late to begin to address the issue, what is this multipolar world? How is it different from, for example, the geopolitical block system that we saw, for example, in the 19th century, and we have seen time and time again in human history, which just ends up with different groups of interests fighting one another for dominance. We have to think now as to what is it about this new multipolar era that's going to distinguish it from previous attempts historically. And it has to do, of course, with institutions, robust institutions that guarantee security. It has to do with a rethinking of what is the nation state. And it definitely has to do with what are the measures that need to be taken to provide the very best support for the development of all human beings on this planet, their full potential and the wealth that we need to put behind each individual on this planet so as to enable them to achieve what it is that they are capable of achieving. What does that take? We haven't even started seriously on this conversation, I don't think, other than the UN's developmental goals, which I think get a lot of lip support, but no convincing effort behind them. So I'll close at that. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak and to hear the very encouraging words that I have heard this morning and this afternoon, your time. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor. I just want to let people know in the chat, I amended the correct link and document. The amended link includes a call for enforcing Resolution 242 that was passed by the United Nations. And it also includes another step, which is that we demand the end of forced migration from Gaza, and we demand a ceasefire and an end to the daily killing by all means available. So people can read the amended petition. It's in the chat. It's the most recent link I just put. And so with that, Kynan, I want to go to you and I want to get your thoughts on this too. Kynan is also a veteran interventionist as well. He actually kind of kicked off the movement we had of interventions all the way back in October. Okay. Not sure what that's about. But yes, Kynan, please, go ahead.
I mean, I think Harley and Professor Barrett have said, a lot already, but I just encourage everyone to follow Robert's example because, this isn't a moment where we can just sit back and have normal lives, given what's happening right now in Gaza. We really you really should put yourself in the shoes of an 18-year-old in Palestine and realize what they're going through and realize that they're not going to be able to change the situation, but we have an opportunity right now here in the West. And, I just, look up town halls that are happening in your area. You can find these events quite easily, register for them, bring a friend who can record you and stand up. And obviously deliver something coherent as well. And Robert obviously did that. So I just encourage everyone to go out and intervene and do this kind of thing. I had done it last year, October of last year, against Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez with you, Jose, and that got extremely viral. And we were able to reach a lot of people, inspire a lot of people. So just go out and do it.
Perfect. Okay, so we're getting close to time here, so we're going to do one final question, and then we're going to go to final remarks. So let me just pull up the final question here. I think this one is directed towards Harley, but this one can be opened also to everyone here. Well, you know what? I'll combine some of these, actually. So we got one question from John, which is, what is the U.S.'s goal? On one hand, the U.S. says Russia has no right to invade a sovereign nation like Ukraine, yet the U.S. is illegally occupying Syria, which is a sovereign nation. And then secondly, can someone explain if UN, the United Nations, actually demarcated the boundaries of Israel versus Palestine in 1948? Why was there no international force to enforce them until both countries organized military arm? And also, do you think Israel will use its nuclear arsenal? So let's start with Harley and then go to Professor Barrett.
Well, the first point raised is U.S. hypocrisy, and there's not much you can say about it. The U.S. government, as long as it continues with this path of a bipartisan commitment to defending the empire, is going to commit atrocities and be hypocritical about it. And that's what we're talking about. It's up to us to change that. In terms of the situation in the map drawing and everything else, the UN had no real capability in 1948. We'd come out of a world war. The situation was being, again, manipulated from outside forces. In this case, there was still the British mandate. And the agreements that were made about the maps and everything else were largely from the British, going back to the Peel Commission in 1937, I think. And the question is, was there ever really a serious intent to have a Palestinian state on behalf of the global powers? And I would argue that if they did have that intent, they didn't do anything about it. And again, this is where the lost opportunities come into play. I just want to add one point here in conclusion. I just saw something from Scott Ritter, where he said that if Israel really wants to do something with Hamas, they should adopt a ceasefire, full humanitarian assistance, and an offer of direct negotiations with Hamas. Now, let me just add that the subject of those direct negotiations should be the two-state solution and the Oasis plan. And what Ritter says is that if Hamas refused that, they would be fully discredited. I think this is the kind of thinking, without necessarily endorsing what he's saying. I mean, a lot of it is coherent with what we're saying, but it's the kind of thinking that has to be brought into the discussion.
Okay, great. Okay, great. And Professor?
Yeah, a couple of points. So with respect to the first, I want to note that given that the US is formally committed to a policy of continuing hegemony, you can't expect any rationality. Rationality does not follow from a commitment to being the global hegemon. So we're dealing with with an actor, in other words, the United States, which has to be fundamentally irrational because no one else in the world wants this hegemon. Second thought, with respect to Israel, I am worried about the noises we hear from both from the rational actors in this game, that they do include Russia and China. But I am worried that we hear both from Russia and from China a lot of references to the two-state solution. Now, I'm not at all sure what exactly it is, what they mean by two-state solution. And I think that does need a great deal more unpacking than many of the world's leaders are currently willing to give us. The problem, it seems to me, starts at the very foundation of Israel, as was mentioned just a moment ago by Kainan, without at the same time there being an establishment of a state of Palestine. There is no possible future whatsoever if by two-state solution we mean something along the lines of a Palestine that is as fragmented as the occupied territories are at the moment, which is totally unacceptable and inhumane. You cannot run a state that comprises a number of disjointed territories, the traffic between them being controlled by Israel, and with Israel having its hands over the levers of power and of energy and of water. This is not a start for any kind of sensible solution. If that's what we mean by two-state solution, forget about it. It's not going to work. I also worry what we need, in other words, is a total reconfiguration of this geographical area of the world. We cannot any longer be bound by the thinking of the late 1940s. That was appropriate in the 1940s up to a point. It is no longer the correct intellectual framework to address the problems that we encounter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Kynan, unless you have any responses to those questions, I think I want to go to the final thoughts with you starting us off.
No, I don't really have any responses. I would just encourage people to get involved with the LaRouche organization, with the Schiller Institute, and to really seize the moment right now. And I would also encourage people to study Lyndon LaRouche's policy proposals for these regions, and really think of a solution beyond, being pro-Palestine, pro-Israel, or anti-Palestine, anti-Israel. I don't think this is a moment where we can just take sides and moralize about the conflict. It really requires a solution on the higher level. And yeah, so I would just leave it at that. Study these proposals, bring it to college campuses, organize with them, and I think you'll be able to inspire people.
Okay. Professor? Any final thoughts?
Totally support what Kynan is urging us to do. These are not normal times. We do face, even to an even greater degree than with the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1961, when at least we were dealing with two rational actors. The United States is no longer a rational actor, as I've just explained. So we're in greater danger of nuclear annihilation than we have ever been at any point in history. These are not normal times. We have to ask ourselves, what is it that what is it I can do? Thank you.
Harley?
I really have nothing more to add except that I would fully endorse the wise words of Kynan in his appeal to people to take personal responsibility, and to what Professor Barrett said about the danger. This is something that people kind of shrug off or don't want to hear about, but they have to hear it. It's real. It's an incredibly dangerous moment for human civilization. And we can't hold ourselves back for fear that people are going to be upset with what we say. People should be upset by what's happening. And it's not just you want to upset them, but you want to show them a means of thinking to get out of the crisis. And I think that's the important role that the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche organization are playing in the world today. So thank you for your attention today, and I hope we've added some ideas to the conversations that you'll have with your friends and family.
Okay, thank you. Harley Schlanger, Professor Boyd Barrett, Kynan Thistlethwaite, I want to thank you all for making this a great Saturday town hall. And to the viewers who may have just been coming on for the first time or recurring, I want to pose this to you. What we need right now is we need 20 people deploying on the streets to do some of the things that we presented today, whether that was participating in a sit-in where there is singing involved, or going in front of a Columbia campus and actually bringing these ideas and telling people that they need to do something. Point is, we need 20 people at minimum deployed this week. All of us should place ourselves, who are not in Gaza, spiritually in Gaza, and we should act as if our bodies are there right now. What would you do? How would you act if you were in that situation? And now realize that there is a 15-year-old boy who doesn't have the choice to think like that and is forced to think like that. What are you going to do about that now? And so we would go throughout every nation in the world, pleading with people, look at my situation and look what's going to happen to me. Are you really going to let this happen? That's what's going on in Palestine right now, and that's what's happening in Gaza. And that's how we should act right now. And so on behalf of everyone here of the town hall and part of our organization, the Palestinians are human beings too. They're not animals. We shouldn't treat them like that. 7,500 dead and more counting just in the invasion last night. Are you prepared to actually do something about it right now? And which brings us back to the title of our program today. The choice is now between coexisting through nonviolence or violent annihilation. And so with that, I want to thank all of you again for coming on the show and for listening with us. And please deploy with us. Contact us, contact me directly, Anastasia, any of the organizers. Thank you.